What if some of the most chilling crimes in history were never solved? Imagine lives vanished without a trace, families left with only questions and heartbreak. In this video, we dive deep into the darkest unsolved mysteries, cases so disturbing and baffling that even decades later, answers remain elusive. Prepare yourself to uncover stories of vanished children, brutal murders, and haunting disappearances that continue to shock and mystify the world. Stay with us as we reveal the truth behind these forgotten horrors. The Black Dahlia Murder. In the early hours of January 15, 1947, Los Angeles was gripped by a discovery so grotesque that it would define the city's dark underbelly for decades to come. In a vacant lot near Leimert Park, a young woman's body was found severed at the waist, drained of blood, her mouth slashed into a ghastly smile extending from ear to ear. Her arms were raised over her head, her body posed. The woman was Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress, later immortalized in headlines as the Black Dahlia. A mother out on a morning walk with her child was the first to see what she initially believed was a discarded mannequin. The body was meticulously cleaned, showing no trace of blood at the scene, leading investigators to conclude she had been murdered elsewhere and then brought to that location. Her upper and lower halves had been separated with surgical precision, and the crime scene lacked the chaos typical of impulsive killings. This murder had been planned, calculated. Elizabeth Short had moved from Massachusetts to California, chasing dreams of fame. Her striking beauty, dark hair, and preference for black clothing had earned her the nickname that would soon haunt newspapers across the nation. Friends described her as friendly but elusive, someone with aspirations far greater than her modest circumstances. She had no steady income, no real connections in the Hollywood elite. She drifted through relationships and temporary living arrangements, often relying on the kindness or exploitation of men to get by. When her murder hit the headlines, media frenzy followed. The press sensationalized Elizabeth's lifestyle, often labeling her as promiscuous or a party girl, fueling a narrative that suggested she had brought danger upon herself. This distorted view of her life contributed to public fascination and morbid curiosity, but offered little in the way of meaningful leads. The Los Angeles Police Department faced a tidal wave of public and political pressure. Over 150 suspects were considered, and the case was complicated further by dozens of false confessions. One man, Joseph Dumais, a former Army soldier, confessed to the murder, only to be released when the LAPD confirmed he was in another state at the time. Another confession came from a man in Pennsylvania who said he'd had dreams of the murder. None of them panned out. What made the Black Dahlia case even more disturbing was the deliberate nature of the mutilation. Experts noted the clean bisection of her torso mirrored a medical procedure taught during the 1930s. This detail led investigators to suspect a doctor, surgeon, or someone with medical training. Among the many suspects, one stood out, Dr. George Hodel. Hodel, a wealthy and well-connected physician in Los Angeles, had a checkered past that included allegations of sexual abuse, even by members of his own family. His house was bugged by the LAPD in 1950 as part of an unrelated investigation. During the surveillance, he was overheard saying, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." That chilling line, along with suspicious behavior and connections to surrealist art involving posed human forms, made Hodel a prime suspect. Still, no charges were ever brought against him. The investigation slowly lost momentum. Over the years, multiple books, films, and documentaries would attempt to piece together what happened to Elizabeth Short, but the truth remained elusive. Her life was reduced to a mystery, her identity swallowed by a moniker and a myth. Even with the advancement of forensic science, including DNA analysis, no conclusive evidence has ever tied anyone to her murder. A series of letters sent to newspapers shortly after the murder, allegedly from the killer, contained personal items of Elizabeth's, including her birth certificate and photos. They were signed, chillingly, the Black Dahlia Avenger. While intriguing, handwriting analysis and fingerprint testing were inconclusive. These messages added to the aura of theatricality surrounding the crime, suggesting that the murderer might have wanted the attention, craved the spotlight just as much as his victim once did. Decades passed, and the case remained open but cold. In 2003, Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD detective and son of Dr. George Hodel, published a book claiming that his father was indeed the killer. Using photographs, timeline analysis, and access to official records, Steve presented a compelling, though circumstantial, case. The LAPD acknowledged that George Hodel had been a suspect, but they never reopened the case based on Steve's findings. Public opinion remains split. Some believe Steve's theory is accurate, others see it as a son's attempt to make sense of a dark legacy. Today, the lot where Elizabeth Short's body was found is just another patch of Los Angeles. There's no memorial, no plaque, just faded curiosity and silence. But every few years, journalists, amateur sleuths, and writers resurrect the case, hoping that perhaps a new piece of evidence, a re-examined file, or a deathbed confession might finally unlock the truth. For now, Elizabeth remains an icon of mystery and tragedy, her smile, carved by a monster, frozen in time. The Black Dahlia murder isn't just a cold case. It's a cultural scar, a symbol of Hollywood's underbelly, and a reminder that behind the glamour and dreams of the silver screen lies a darkness that can consume even the brightest lights. The Boy in the Box. On a cold February day in 1957, a college student walking through the woods in Fox Chase, Philadelphia, stumbled upon a discarded cardboard box near Susquehanna Road. Inside it was the small, battered body of a young boy. He was naked, badly bruised, and wrapped in a cheap flannel blanket. The box had once held a baby bassinet sold by a local department store, and the child appeared to be about 4 to 6 years old. No one knew who he was. No one came forward. And despite an investigation that spanned decades, he would come to be known only as America's unknown child. Police were immediately struck by the tragic scene. The boy's hair had been crudely chopped, possibly post-mortem, and his body bore signs of long-term physical abuse. He was thin and malnourished, with surgical scars on his ankle and groin. The condition of his hands and feet suggested he had been regularly bathed even after death. Investigators theorized this might have been an attempt by the killer to remove fingerprints or other identifying evidence. Yet despite a flood of posters, press coverage, and a city desperate for answers, no one stepped forward to claim the boy. The media's attention was intense. Flyers featuring the boy's face were sent out with utility bills, placed in shop windows, and even inserted into every Philadelphia gas bill that month. His photograph, haunting, innocent, lifeless, was seen by hundreds of thousands. Still, no relatives, neighbors, or teachers recognized him. It was as though he had never existed. The box he was found in was traced back to a local JCPenney store, where the bassinet had been sold. Investigators followed the sales records but hit a dead end. The flannel blanket had an unusual stitching pattern and was sent to experts nationwide, but again, no matches. More than 400 leads poured in during the first month alone, ranging from missing children across states to escaped or abandoned orphans. None brought the police closer to the boy's name. Over time, detectives grew more desperate. One theory was that the boy had been dumped by a traveling carnival worker or a migrant family, constantly on the move. Another pointed toward a foster home located less than 2 miles from where the body was discovered. The home had a reputation for secrecy and cruelty, but without any direct evidence linking them to the crime, the lead evaporated. In the 1960s, a psychic claimed to have visions of a house that matched the appearance of the foster home. Detectives, desperate for any new angle, followed up, even going so far as to unofficially dig up the yard, but again, nothing. The boy remained nameless, his story frozen in time. Decades passed. Technology evolved. In the 1990s, the case was reopened with the hope that DNA analysis might yield results. The boy's body, originally buried in a pauper's grave, was exhumed in 1998. Samples were taken, and a facial reconstruction was created using updated forensic techniques. His body was reburied in a cemetery under a new headstone that read, "America's Unknown Child." The public didn't forget. Nor did the detectives. Perhaps the most intriguing lead came in 2002, when a woman known only as M told investigators a chilling story. She claimed that her mother had purchased a young boy in 1954, kept him locked in a basement, and abused him for years before ultimately killing him in a fit of rage. M alleged that after the boy's death, her mother cut his hair and dumped him in the woods. Detectives initially found elements of her story compelling. She described specific scars and details about the box and blanket that hadn't been publicly released. But investigators struggled to verify her claims. There was no official record of the boy's supposed purchase or any connection between M's mother and the box manufacturer. A search of the property yielded nothing. The case slipped once more into the darkness. Then, in late 2022, a breakthrough. Using modern genealogical DNA techniques, the same kind that helped identify the Golden State Killer, authorities were able to generate a partial family tree. By early 2023, officials finally announced that they had identified the boy, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born in 1953. His parents were confirmed, though police withheld their names publicly due to privacy concerns and the fact that they were both deceased. Joseph had been born into a troubled family, and while he had siblings, none had known of his existence. Though the name Joseph Zarelli gave him an identity, it did not give him justice. Authorities still do not know who killed him. No one has been arrested, and the details of his final days remain shrouded in mystery. It's possible that those responsible for his death are already gone. But the identification, coming nearly 66 years after his body was found, offered a small piece of resolution in one of America's longest-running cold cases. The boy in the box's story has since become a somber case study in the evolution of forensic science. From flyers mailed with utility bills to DNA sequenced from degraded bones, Joseph's story bridges two eras of policing. His grave, once anonymous, now bears a name. Visitors still leave flowers, toys, and notes. One message simply reads, "You were never forgotten." The Villisca Axe Murders. On the morning of June 10, 1912, in the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, neighbor Mary Peckham noticed that the Moore household was unusually still. The Moores, Josiah, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, were a well-respected family. The day before, they had hosted a Sunday evening church program, which had ended late. 2 neighbor girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, were invited to spend the night. When Mary received no answer at the door, she called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived with a spare key. What he found inside would sear itself into the annals of American crime forever. In the upstairs bedroom, Josiah and Sarah Moore lay lifeless in their bed, bludgeoned with an axe. The attack had been so vicious that Josiah's face was unrecognizable. Sarah's wounds were just as brutal. In the adjacent room, their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, had suffered the same fate. All had been murdered in their sleep. Downstairs, in the guest room, the bodies of the Stillinger sisters were discovered, also killed with the same implement. Lena Stillinger, 12, appeared to have been awake at the time of the attack. She had defensive wounds and was found in a state that suggested a possible sexual motive, although no clear evidence of assault was found. This small detail introduced an element of sadistic cruelty that horrified even the most seasoned investigators of the time. A bloodied axe was found leaning against the wall in the guest room. The killer had covered mirrors and glass surfaces with cloth or clothing. He had also draped cloth over the victims' faces and covered windows with garments to block out light, as though he didn't want to be seen or couldn't face what he had done. Strangely, 2 plates of uneaten food were left on the kitchen table, and a bowl of bloody water sat in the washbasin. The killer may have cleaned himself before leaving. The entire town of Villisca descended into panic. Doors were locked. Rumors flew. Whispers of a serial killer swept the region. The murders had all the signs of premeditation and patience. It was believed the killer had entered the house while the family was at the church program, hiding in the attic until the family went to bed. Shoe prints suggested someone had crept from room to room in the dead of night, extinguishing lives one by one with the blunt side of an axe. The blade was only used on Josiah, which implied something more personal about his killing. In the days that followed, several suspects emerged, but no one could be tied definitively to the crime. One early suspect was Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and former state senator. Josiah Moore had once worked for Jones but left under tense circumstances, allegedly taking valuable clients with him. Some townsfolk speculated that Jones hired a killer out of revenge. One possible hitman was William Mansfield, suspected in other axe murders in Illinois and Kansas, but lack of evidence kept the case stagnant. Another suspect was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had attended the Moore's church program the night of the murders. Kelly was an odd figure, a self-described man of God, with a history of mental illness, voyeurism, and sending disturbing letters. He left town early the next morning on a train. Years later, Kelly actually confessed to the murders, claiming he was ordered by God to kill. However, his confession was erratic and contradictory. He later recanted, and after 2 trials, he was acquitted. Despite the horror of the murders, the investigation was marred by early contamination of the crime scene. Curious locals wandered through the Moore house before the police could fully secure it, trampling over potential evidence. This lack of early forensic control, coupled with the rudimentary investigative techniques of the time, doomed the case to mystery. Some theorists later connected the Villisca killings to a series of similar axe murders in the Midwest between 1911 and 1912. The pattern involved families murdered in their sleep, covered mirrors, and the use of axes found at the crime scenes. In each case, the killer left few clues and appeared to vanish without a trace. Could the Villisca killer have been a serial murderer roaming from town to town by rail? The theory gained traction but never produced a conclusive suspect. More than a century has passed, yet the Villisca axe murders remain officially unsolved. The Moore house has since been preserved as a historical site and paranormal attraction. Visitors claim to hear children's voices, footsteps, and slamming doors. Some even say they've seen ghostly apparitions. Whether haunted by spirits or the collective memory of brutality, the house still stands as a chilling monument to one of America's most brutal unsolved crimes. What makes the Villisca case so haunting is not just the savage nature of the killings, but the silence that followed. 8 people murdered under one roof, 6 of them children, and not a single conviction. The small-town tranquility of Villisca was shattered forever. A century later, despite books, documentaries, and ghost hunts, the question lingers like a fog. Who entered that house in the night, and why? The Highway of Tears. Stretching over 700 kilometers across British Columbia, Canada, Highway 16 is known for its scenic beauty, but also for something much darker. Since 1969, this stretch of road between Prince George and Prince Rupert has become infamous for a series of unsolved disappearances and murders, mostly involving Indigenous women and girls. This chilling phenomenon is known as the Highway of Tears. The first widely recognized case is that of Gloria Moody, a 26-year-old Indigenous woman and mother of 2. On October 25, 1969, Gloria had gone out with her brother to a bar in Williams Lake. The next day, her body was found in the woods outside town. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. Her murder was never solved. Gloria's death set a grim precedent, one that would be followed by many similar cases along the same highway. Over the decades, more than 40 women, mostly Indigenous, went missing or were found murdered along Highway 16. The real number may be higher. Most of the victims were last seen hitchhiking, a common mode of travel in rural Canada, especially for those without access to reliable transportation. Many communities along the route are remote and impoverished, especially Indigenous reserves where residents often have few options for mobility. For young women trying to get to school, work, or simply visit family, thumbing a ride was sometimes the only way. One of the most publicized cases is that of Ramona Wilson, a 16-year-old Gittinmox girl who disappeared in 1994 while hitchhiking to a friend's house in Smithers. Her remains were found almost a year later, in a wooded area near the Smithers airport. Despite intense media coverage and public outcry, Ramona's case remains unsolved. Her mother still visits the site where her daughter was found, marking the place with flowers and offerings, reminders of a life taken too soon and justice never delivered. In 2002, Nicole Hoare, a 25-year-old white woman working as a tree planter, went missing while hitchhiking to visit her sister. Nicole's disappearance drew significant attention and briefly re-energized the investigation into the Highway of Tears cases. But even with the public pressure, no suspects were arrested, and Nicole's fate remains unknown. That disparity in urgency between Nicole's case and those of Indigenous victims underscored a deep-rooted problem, one that activists had been warning about for years. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, created an official Highway of Tears task force in 2005, focusing on 9 specific cases, though more victims were later added. Investigators admitted early missteps, including slow response times, lack of coordination with Indigenous communities, and systemic biases. Critics argued that the RCMP often dismissed missing Indigenous women as runaways or addicts, rather than victims. In many cases, families had to beg authorities to open missing persons files. Technology eventually provided some answers. In 2010, DNA evidence linked an American man, Bobby Jack Fowler, to the 1974 murder of Colleen Macmillan, a 16-year-old girl killed along the highway. Fowler, who died in prison in 2006, had a violent criminal history and had been traveling through Canada in the 1970s. Authorities suspect he may have been responsible for several other Highway of Tears cases, but without definitive proof, many of the murders remain open. Beyond individual perpetrators, the crisis of the Highway of Tears reveals a broader failure. The disappearances occur at the intersection of poverty, racism, and indifference. Many of the Indigenous victims lived in areas plagued by unemployment, substance abuse, and historical trauma. The Canadian government's legacy of residential schools, cultural erasure, and systemic neglect laid the foundation for a cycle of marginalization. This made Indigenous women more vulnerable, less protected, and far less likely to have their cases prioritized. In response to years of advocacy, the Canadian government launched a national inquiry in 2016 into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MILG. The final report, released in 2019, was a damning indictment. It concluded that Canada's treatment of Indigenous women amounted to a form of genocide, not in the immediate sense of mass killing, but through persistent policies that allowed violence, exploitation, and neglect to flourish. Along Highway 16 today, signs dot the road warning women not to hitchhike. Billboards with photos of missing girls call for witnesses to come forward. In some communities, volunteer patrols offer rides to reduce risk. Bus service, long requested by local leaders, was finally introduced in sections of the highway to give residents safer alternatives. Yet fear and grief still linger. For the families, the pain has never ended. Each name on the list is a person, a daughter, a sister, a mother, whose life was stolen without explanation. Each unsolved case is a wound that refuses to close. They gather at annual vigils, light candles, and march with photos of their loved ones, demanding answers from a system that for too long offered none. The Highway of Tears is more than a series of crimes, it is a symbol of systemic failure. It reminds the world that some lives are treated as disposable, and some stories are never given the ending they deserve. Until every name is accounted for, and every family receives justice, the road will remain haunted, not by ghosts, but by questions. The Sodder children vanish. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Sodder family, George and Jenny and 9 of their 10 children, had just celebrated a warm, festive evening. The stockings were hung, the younger kids had been allowed to stay up late, and the older boys helped bring in the cows and close up the family's coal hauling business for the holiday. But what began as a night of joy turned into one of the most enduring and heartbreaking mysteries in American history. Sometime around 1 a.m. on December 25th, a fire broke out in the Sodder home. Jenny was awakened by the sound of something hitting the roof, followed by a rolling noise. Moments later, the house was engulfed in flames. George and Jenny escaped with 4 of their children. But 5, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, were never seen again. The Sodders assumed, along with the fire department and local authorities, that the children had perished in the blaze. But within days, questions began to mount. And over the following years, those questions would evolve into one of the most disturbing unsolved disappearances in American history. The fire department, delayed and understaffed because of the holiday, didn't arrive until nearly 8 a.m., long after the house had burned to the ground. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, claimed no remains were found in the ashes, no bones, no evidence of human remains at all. For a house fire that had supposedly incinerated 5 children, this was deeply unusual. Even in extreme fires, bones are typically left behind. A crematorium expert later told the family that even in a 2-hour cremation at 2000 degrees, bones remain. The solder fire had burned for only 45 minutes. More strange details soon emerged. The phone line had been cut, not by the fire, but manually, outside the house. The family's ladder, usually kept propped against the house, was found thrown down an embankment. George's 2 trucks, which he had hoped to use to reach the upper floor of the house, wouldn't start, even though they had worked the day before. A man was seen stealing a mechanical block and tackle from the Sodders' property shortly before the fire. Another man was reportedly seen watching the house from a car parked on the highway. In the months following the fire, reports trickled in. A bus driver said he saw balls of fire thrown at the house that night. Jenny found a hard rubber object in the yard, perhaps a napalm pineapple bomb. A woman claimed to have seen the missing children peering out of a car window that night. Later, a waitress in a town 50 miles away insisted she had served them breakfast the next morning with 2 unknown adults. The Sodders became convinced their children had not died in the fire, they had been abducted. Motives quickly became a focal point. George Sodder was a proud and outspoken critic of Mussolini. Born in Italy, George often clashed with other Italian immigrants in Fayetteville, many of whom were still loyal to their homeland. Shortly before the fire, a man had come to the house looking for work and warned George that his house would go up in smoke if he didn't stop criticizing Mussolini. Another time, a man trying to sell life insurance became angry when George refused and said, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." Despite mounting evidence of foul play, local officials remained adamant that the children had died in the fire. A coroner's jury quickly ruled the fire accidental, caused by faulty wiring, even though the Christmas lights reportedly stayed on throughout the blaze, suggesting the wiring was intact. The scene was bulldozed within days. No formal investigation was conducted. Undeterred, the Sodders launched a tireless campaign. They printed flyers, handed out pamphlets, and by 1950, had erected a massive billboard along Route 16 with the children's faces, offering a $10,000 reward for information. The sign became an iconic image of the case, viewed by thousands over the years. George and Jenny followed every lead, to Florida, Texas, even as far as Oklahoma, chasing sightings and rumors. But they never found definitive answers. One of the strangest twists came in 1967. Jenny received an envelope postmarked from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back was a handwritten note. "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Ill boys." A 90132 or 35. The man bore a striking resemblance to Louis. George and Jenny were convinced it was him. They hired a private detective to investigate, who vanished and was never heard from again. Though they never stopped searching, George died in 1969. Jenny continued her quest for truth until her death in 1989. The remaining Sodder children carried the torch after their parents were gone, but with each passing year, the mystery deepened. The billboard, which had stood for decades, was eventually taken down in the 1980s. To this day, no conclusive evidence has surfaced to prove whether the children died in the fire or were taken. No remains. No verified sightings. No confessions. Only whispers, strange clues, and a family's unrelenting grief. The Sodder children's case remains one of the most perplexing, unsolved disappearances in U.S. history. It touches on everything from small-town politics and immigrant tensions to possible kidnapping rings and institutional cover-up. It asks a question with no satisfying answer. How can 5 children simply vanish into the night and never be found?